Hello, hello, hello. Okay, great. Thank you. I am so excited to introduce Bryan Caplan, a economist at George Mason University, a New York Times bestseller, and somebody who I have personally heard from people at this event. They go, his book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, have convinced me to have kids. But one of the things I appreciate most about him in this next book that he's releasing is that he does these in these amazing graphic novels, which make them so great when you are engaging your kids with these ideas. Because what's more important than doing that? And I'd love to have you up on stage here. He, within the pronatalist space, is the OG. He's convinced at least 100 people from his personal surveys to have kids. So it's 100 lives that wouldn't exist without this guy.
All right. Thank you very much, Malcolm. Yes, so this is a graphic novel. I was a little worried we wouldn't get to have slides, so you wouldn't get to see the artwork. This book is coming out May 1st. Just to understand what I'm even doing here, there are all these great ideas, great research, but it's published in journals that almost no one would read. When you read them, it's boring. And the research is really important. It says something that is highly relevant to the world and highly relevant to the Free State Project. So I'm hoping to see this become a real estate mecca of the world because you can build stuff here, and yes, we can. All right, so it's a little far over, but hopefully you can get an idea about what the artwork is saying. A lot of what I'm doing here is I just want to go and figure out a way to make intrinsically fascinating research actually fascinating to people. I also want to expand the audience. I always try to write books that at least appeal to the intelligent layman. But when I was doing my first graphic novel, I noticed, wow, my 5-year-old daughter is reading over my shoulder. I think I've got something here. And here I'm trying to do the same thing. So yeah, the book is called Bill Baby Bill, The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation. Over here we have Bill Fischel, who is probably the economist who is most pro-zoning in the whole profession that I know of. I'm going to be on a panel with him where we can actually argue with this, so maybe I'm totally wrong, but tonight I'll give you my version. All right, so what is wrong with the housing market? Over the last 50 years, U.S. housing prices have really increased a lot more than inflation, and especially in what are usually considered the most desirable areas of the country to live. So places like Boston, Bay Area, Los Angeles, these are the areas that have seen especially high increases, but still, just averaging over the high country, it is a lot. And supply and demand is the obvious story. I assume everyone here has heard of supply and demand. Yeah, it's a great theory of everything. But supply and demand, though not wrong, is misleading in this case because when you say supply and demand, it does kind of suggest the problem is natural scarcity. Like you say, well, supply and demand, that's why front row tickets at the football game are really high. Yeah, well, like by definition, there can't be everyone can't be in the front row at the football game. So there is a natural scarcity that explains why the prices are high. On the other hand, there is a large body of evidence saying that the main reason why housing is getting more expensive is not natural scarcity. Rather, housing prices drastically increase because there has been such strict regulation which has artificially reduced supply and by a lot. Let's see. So yes, this is what's wrong with the housing market. Now, by the way, this is one where I was trying to figure out what visual metaphor should I use. And it's like, well, who is Uncle Sam? Does Uncle Sam represent the federal government or government in general? And it's like, we don't have a really good symbol for state and local government, so I just went with Uncle Sam as a symbol of government itself. Over in the pictures, if you can see it, there is my recurring bureaucrat character who loves saying no to everything. So here is a main list of the kinds of regulations that seem to matter. So first of all, we have height restrictions. We have an incredible technology for building very tall buildings in very desirable areas, which allows an enormous number of people to enjoy those areas. As you may have heard, Empire State Building is built in like a year. Physically, it is easy to go and build skyscrapers with modern technology, but getting actual permission, getting the pieces of paper that say you're allowed to build this skyscraper is extremely difficult in most of the country, which means that very few of them actually get built. Oh, sorry, we're advancing too fast. Yes, go back. All right, yes. All right. Now, something else which is very special, mostly for the United States, because in Europe they don't have much of this, multifamily restrictions. It's very hard to get permission to build multifamily dwellings in the United States. So a very large percentage of residential land is set aside just for single-family homes. Can't do apartments, can't do townhomes, only single-family homes. That's all that's allowed. And then even when we do allow single-family homes, it is very standard to have a minimum lot size. To say you've got to use at least an acre of land, 2 acres of land, 5 acres of land. It's like, well, can't we fit physically a lot more houses in the space? Of course we could, but the law says that you cannot. What's striking is that developers normally just go up to the max, which is a strong sign the regulation really matters. They will just build as many houses as they're allowed to, which makes sense because, as we're going to see, while people do like having some extra yard, they're not willing to pay that much for it. So the actual value of just giving someone an acre of forest is really low in terms of their willingness to pay. All right, now something else which seems like it would just be a minor topic but turns out to be a big deal is just minimum parking requirements. So if you guys may have heard of Donald Shoup's book, The High Cost of Free Parking, it is the most fascinating 800-page book you'll ever read about parking. But like it's like, but you read this thing, like, this is actually really good. I'm like learning about parking. It's so amazing. Right? It contains all kinds of shocking facts, like when you're stuck in traffic, about a quarter of the people that are there are looking for parking. It's like, so parking, not pricing parking properly actually causes another problem of making it really hard to drive. But anyway, it is very standard to require builders to construct 2 or 3 parking spots for every apartment that they're building, even though one of the main points of building an apartment is to say that you don't need a car, but no, you have to go and have that. Right, and plenty more. This is just scratching the surface. All right, so yes, here are some of the drawings showing what's going on. So yes, here we have the character of the fat cat, the developer, wanting to go and build skyscrapers, but Uncle Sam won't let him, government won't let him. We've got wants to go and do multifamily, but government won't let him do that. Keep going. Yes, all right, now how much does regulation actually raise prices? Here is how housing markets historically worked. We have data going back over 100 years for a lot of countries. The way that housing markets normally work is there's an increase in demand, which raises prices above the cost of production. And then when the price of something is above its cost of production, what does the free market do? Build more, and they keep building more until the price comes back down to the cost of production. This is the normal way for any market to work. If there's an increase in demand for boba tea stores are profitable. People notice this, and then they start building more boba tea stores, and then the price goes back down, and finally, it is no longer an especially profitable industry to enter. So this is the normal thing. Normally, the way the industry works is that whenever prices get above the cost of production, builders start building more until the price goes back down to break-even levels. All right, so a rough estimate is that right now, the average for the U.S. is that housing prices are about double the break-even level based upon physical costs, based upon the actual physical costs of building homes, including the land. Right now, how would we know this? Right, there are 2 famous economists, Ed Glazer and Joe Jerko. That is the correct pronunciation, Jerko. All right, and what they do is they spend a lot of time looking at very similar homes that have different amounts of land. So the homes are very similar, but they have different amounts of land. So this gives you an idea of how much do people value a piece of land that you can't build anything on. Right? Everyone here probably has some land that you can't really build anything on. You can't go, it's like, so I've got this house, I've got this land, and how good would it be if you just gave me another 100 square feet of land? How much would you pay for that? It's like, all right, it's worth something. But it turns out that most people do not particularly appreciate that extra land. They're only willing to pay a modest additional sum for it. So once you go and use this method to figure out what is the value of land that does not have a piece of paper entitling you to build something on it attached to it, what is that land worth? So then we can estimate the pure value of land that is unimprovable according to the law. Right, then we can take that, we can then combine that with just standard estimates of construction costs, which you can get out of a book where they tell you how much it costs to go and build something, right? And then we can add the value of the land up to the value of the housing, and then we can look at the difference between this estimate and the actual market price. So that's what researchers do when they're trying to figure out what is the cost of all this regulation. It's not a perfect method. There are other things that have also been done where you just look at things like, well, what's the value of vacant land without permission to build on it? It's like, wow, vacant land where you don't have permission to build isn't worth very much. That is the key variable. Once you get that piece of paper, suddenly that land becomes a gold mine. All right. So, and then over there in the pictures I'm talking about, talking to Glaser and Jerko. All right. So anyway, what the earlier work using this method found is that we have what we call very high zoning taxes. This is a phrase that just means it's all the costs that regulation is adding to the price. So it isn't like a special zoning tax. It's not, there isn't a tax, something the zoning boards do called the zoning tax. Rather, zoning tax equals this estimate of all of the extra costs the government is piling on to real estate. All right, so anyway, earlier work found what we go of these zoning taxes were enormous in the most desirable areas, but then said, the rest of the country's okay. All right, so that was an early position. But later work came along with better data, like they got better data on the value of vacant lots, which allowed them to go and get more detailed estimates of, well, how bad is the regulation in central cities? How bad is it in the suburbs? How bad is it further out? Right? And here is the result from that research. If there's a lot of people who live there, regulation is terrible. The places where regulation is fine are the places where nobody lives. It's like, yeah, well, middle Alaska, you could probably build a skyscraper if you want, but nobody wants to build a skyscraper in the middle Alaska because the economics does not justify it. But in the places where you want to build a skyscraper, it's really hard to build a skyscraper. In the places where you'd want to build multifamily housing, it's really hard to build multifamily housing. In the places where you want to go and squeeze a lot of single-family homes onto a lot, it's really hard to do that. Right. Now, a key point, why do a whole book on housing? Doesn't government mess up a ton of things? I'm suspecting many people here believe that it does. All right, but why housing specifically? It's like, well, look, government could be destroying the chewing gum market, and it's like, all right, it's terrible, but on the other hand, it's just chewing gum. It's not that big of a deal for most people. It's a very small share of income. You could be multiplying the cost of chewing gum by a factor of 5, and it's all right, fine. It is a bad thing government does, but it's not anywhere near the top of the list. Even gasoline. Gasoline is actually a modest share of people's income. People get very angry about the price of gas going up, but it's not that big of a share of people's income. On the other hand, housing is a very large share of people's income. So roughly people are spending about 20% of their income on shelter in the United States. So it's a lot. Obviously varies based upon where in the country you are, but still 20% is what we're talking about. So if you're doubling this cost, it is not just any other product that government's messing up. Rather, you are doubling the cost of something that is a very large portion of your budget, which means that there's a large reduction in the standard of living for the entire country. Right? So, rough estimate. If we imagine a world of laissez-faire, right? We can all imagine the world. All right, anyone, like the property owner decides what he does, and if you don't like it, you can take him to court, which is hard, and that's the point. Right? That's a lot of what keeps the system going, is that if you have to go and sue someone because you don't like what they're doing with their property, you probably will just let them do it. All right, so anyway, rough estimate there is that if we could go and cut the price of housing in half, this would cut the overall cost of living by about 10% because you're having 20% of the budget. And if you then go and do the math, that's equivalent to an 11% increase in the standard of living for the country just for deregulating this one market that most people consider too boring even to think about. All right. All right, so now, this is where I come to the part that I'm really excited about, the panacea. All right, so you may or may not have heard that panacea is the Greek goddess of universal remedy, which meant that I could draw all kinds of great panels of the Greek goddess of universal remedy, going and offering salvation to the world. I can cure your ills. Normally, obviously, someone who offers a panacea is just lying to you, but what if there was a panacea? What if there really actually was a policy that wouldn't just have immediate direct benefits for the particular problem we're talking about, but would actually make a major dent in a long list of other problems that people barely consider to be even related to this particular problem? Right, so this is what I say housing deregulation is. It is truly a panacea policy. I'm going to give you a long list of other problems that people are angry about, people are concerned about, and yet almost no one connects it to housing regulation, and they should. All right. So one thing that high prices of housing do is they reduce migration to high productivity areas. So there are some parts of the country that have higher productivity than others, like the Bay Area is really high productivity per worker. And if we could just get a lot more people there, it is very likely there would be a much larger productivity for the world. But it is so expensive to actually move to there that a lot of people will not do so. right? I'm going to talk about this is just leading on, but this is actually one of the best ways to reduce the stagnation problem is to go back to a world where people move to high productivity areas in order to go and contribute to the high productivity parts of the economy. All right, so that's one. But there's a much more general point of, this is another way that we can go and raise living standards. So the one I was saying where we just cut the price of housing, that's basically just arithmetic. This is actually saying it's not just arithmetic, it's actually causal. If we could go and make housing cheaper in high productivity areas, more people would live there and their productivity would be higher. But there's a lot of other problems. I'm only going to talk in detail about a few of them, but I'm happy to go and do Q&A on them. The evidence varying in magnitude and quality, of course, because this is the real world, but still. All right, so mitigating many other social ills, including inequality. So much complaining about inequality, but how many people say there's all this horrible inequality caused by housing regulation? Rare. A lot of people complain about inequality. They'll go and do Occupy Wall Street and well, is Wall Street the problem? How do we know that? And anyway, what does Occupying Wall Street even do? But deregulating housing, that's a different story. Social mobility. So in addition to being a good way to raise productivity, there's also the issue of how easy is it for someone to go and move from a low income to a high income? It used to be in the United States, and I'm going to go over some of the numbers in a little bit, that there was a very simple, straightforward way that a person who wanted upper mobility could get it in the past, and that is just move to a richer area of the country. So it really used to be that if you're in Mississippi with low income, you could just look at the map and say, if we move to California, move to New York, wages are higher there and we can get an immediate raise. And in those days, there was so little difference in the price of housing in different states that there was very little change in your housing cost when you moved to the higher income areas. So you would basically move to another area, get a much better job, pay only a little bit more in housing, and then pocket the difference. This used to be available to anyone in the U.S. that was in a poor area of the country. I think it's how badly do you want to improve your lot in life? If you say, I don't care that much, I'll stay here, right? Well, then you can't do it. But if you say, I'm willing to move, you could get it. Something else. So I was actually one of the students of Anne Case, who, together with Nobel Prize winner Angus Deaton, wrote this book on deaths of despair. Their story is that a very large reason for why working class males in America have been doing so poorly by so many measures is the lack of meaningful work. Right? And what is it? Well, it basically just says that working class males don't like doing service sector jobs. They don't like work they feel is traditionally unmanly. Well, what is manlier work than construction? It is a stereotypically manly job, which also pays very well. So if we were to go and have a large increase in the amount of construction we're doing, there would also be automatically a large increase in employment prospects for working class males who seem like they've been doing especially badly. Right? And again, this is important because it's already a big industry. Even though I talk about construction being strangled, well, it's strangled relative to its potential, but it still is one that employs about 8 million people. So if you imagine that being just doubling in size for the period where we are building a lot more stuff, we're talking about a large change in the prospects for a very large number of people. Right, homelessness. This is one where initially I was actually skeptical myself because thinking, well, isn't a lot of homelessness just behavioral and based upon dysfunctional life choices? Is it really going to make a big difference if you just make housing cheaper? It's my initial reaction. But here's the thing. When we talk about housing, there's a bunch of different definitions. And when you hear a high number, that definition is based upon couch surfing as being a major kind of homelessness. Right, so basically it's no fixed address or no permanent one. So just sleeping on your brother's couch could be counted as homelessness in some ways of counting it. But anyway, so I read further and I found there actually is quite good evidence that areas where the rent is really low actually do have low homelessness. I think the best way of thinking about it is you have to be really dysfunctional to be unable to afford to make rent in Mississippi. Bay Area is different. So yes, and again, you need to remember that a lot of homelessness is not classic, just someone sleeping on the streets. So in that case, when you're counting homelessness that way, then it is very plausible that deregulation will make a substantial difference. Low birth rates, right? So this is something that I'm interested in, Malcolm's interested in. Well, how do you feel about having kids if you're living in your parents' basement? And yes, when housing is really expensive, people live with their parents for a longer period of time, which means that family formation is delayed, which means that having kids is delayed. And as you may have heard, if you delay that enough, then it's no longer just a matter of delay. It's just you don't do it. Right, so here the number of papers is not as high as I would like, but there are several papers saying that housing prices are have an important effect upon fertility. And there is one that specifically says housing regulation itself reduces fertility, which is nice for my story. Right. So I mean, I will say, like just in terms of having a lot of kids, like if I were in a one-bedroom apartment, I don't think I'd want to have 4 kids either. Right, so it does make sense to me intuitively. If you go and take a look at low fertility countries in Europe, it does seem like places where people just keep living with their parents, in large part because of extremely high prices of housing, are also the ones with lower fertility. So I would say that it all does fit. I'm not saying that is the only factor. Obviously, culture matters too, but still it is a good story. All right, now crime. Like, what in the world does housing regulation have to do with crime? Here there is one bona fide actual experiment in the city of Philadelphia that begins with a shocking fact. It is very normal for there to be vacant lots in high-value cities. Like why? All right, well, maybe you're speculating and thinking that housing is going to get even more expensive later on, but a very large reason why you leave valuable land in high-priced cities vacant is you can't get the permits to build anything there. So if I remember the paper, I think about 12% of the land in urban Philadelphia is vacant. Right, so like 12% of the land, you could build all this stuff, it's high real estate prices, but mostly you just can't get permission. So I mean, what this experiment did is they began by saying, well, it's common that vacant lots become centers of crime. All right, makes sense. Right, so that's where there's gang shootouts, other stuff. Right, so anyway, what they wound up doing is they actually got permission to randomly assign half of the lots in the city for beautification. Not construction, just cleaning up the trash, planting some grass, putting some trees, putting a little picket fence. And then they went and measured crime after the beautification in the area. And remember, this is an actual experiment where some places got the beautification of their vacant lots, others didn't. Right? And they did find a notable effect of just being able to put trees and grass on vacant lots on crime. Right now, when I read this, my reaction is, well, gee, if trees and grass stop crime, how about a building? Seems like a building probably would do a lot better. Now, when you read the paper, they anticipate this, but they are primarily worried that people are going to flip out at them for being IMBYs and wanting to develop things. They say, look, we are not suggesting allowing anyone to build anything. We're not crazy. Right? We just want to go and put grass. But when I read it, it's like, well, wouldn't that be a more reasonable interpretation of your experiment to say that preventing people from building things in a vacant lot causes crime? And again, this is not a small problem when you realize what a large share of land in many major cities, expensive cities, is vacant. Right. Now, last one that is mostly just speculation, but I do like it, is like if only we could have some kind of a major political crusade that everyone could get behind. It's like, well, isn't that fantasy? Well, it's kind of fantasy. But still in the book I say, look, there is every reason for libertarians and conservatives and socialists and progressives to all favor housing deregulation. The arguments vary, but the actual case, but the conclusion still is the same. So it's like, hey, leftists, do you want to have a policy that reduces inequality, improves mobility, helps working class males? Are you into that? All right, well, housing deregulation. All right, hey, conservatives, do you want to have a policy that reduces crime, encourages family formation, leads to economic growth? All right, great. We got a policy for you, and it's also called housing deregulation. Right, so I'm not convinced this would actually work, but it would be nice just to have some big idea that would, in principle, based upon philosophical logic, have cross-party appeal, because there's so little like that we exist other than like banning TikTok. All right, so now I just want to go over some of the particular issues where housing deregulation is very likely to make a big dent in a non-obvious way. All right, so thinking about housing regulation and inequality. All right, so just some basic facts about housing that's probably known to everybody. So first of all, the share of your income that you spend on housing declines with income. Poor people spend a larger share of their income on housing than rich people, which means that anything that reduces the price of this is actually on net reducing inequality by helping people who are poor more than people who are rich, right? And furthermore, owners are also richer than renters on average. Not in every case, it's an average. But if you take a look at median 2015 family income for renters was $34,000, for owners $52,000. All right, so here again, we'll see that if we could go and make housing cheaper, of course, there are people that have a lot of their income invested in housing, and they're worse off. although I'm going to argue that even that is quite a bit less clear than it seems. All right, now less obvious. There is actually a famous paper by a guy who was a grad student at the time who wrote it named Ronley. And let's see, you guys have maybe heard of Thomas Piketty, right? Emmanuel Saez. So anyway, they've done a lot of work on the rise of inequality. It's been criticized on a lot of grounds. But anyway, what Ronley said is if you go over Piketty's work, where he said that the capital share was rising in Western countries. Remember, Capital, this book, got a lot of attention at the time. But anyway, so what Ronley showed is that rising housing prices fully account for capital's rising share. It is not actually true that what we think of as a conventional capitalist like Montgomery Burns. It is not true that their income share even rose over the post-war period. Rather, what happened is we just throw housing into capital, and government strangled the housing market, leading to a large rise in the share of income going to housing, which then makes people think that capital is getting some great deal out of the current system, which it does not seem to be doing. Right, so if we could deregulate this, we could go and solve this problem of capital share being too high caused by government. All right. Now this one is pretty fun. So housing regulation and social mobility. So there's two economists, Ganong and Shawag, who they showed that there used to be a lot of what's called regional income divergence in the U.S. It used to be that rich states were generally growing slower than poor states. Poor states were growing faster than rich states. So basically, there's a long period where the South is catching up to the rest of the country. All right, so this went on for a long period, but it's no longer true. It is no longer true that poor areas of the country are catching up to rich areas of the country. And actually, so just to back up, the normal mechanism is that people are moving from poor areas to rich areas, which means that labor is getting more scarce in the areas where labor is cheaper, so it becomes more expensive. It becomes more abundant in areas where labor is more expensive, so it becomes cheaper. Right? But what they show is that actually in the modern world, unlike the past, migration now goes from rich states to poor states. That is the world that regulation has put us in, where people leave the Bay Area to move to Texas. Right? And they are getting a pay cut normally. Normally you do get a pay cut, but the housing cost is so much lower that you actually have a higher standard of living actually moving. This was historically not true, but it is the world that we have created for ourselves now. All right. Now the deeper story that they go over is they find that there is still a tendency for very high-skilled workers to move to the rich parts of the country, because if you are high income and you get a 10% raise, that's more likely to outweigh the extra cost of real estate. But on the other hand, if you were a janitor, moving from Mississippi to New York City is a way to get a lower living standard, because you could get a large percentage raise, but still will in no way cover the extra cost of the real estate. All right, so that's the idea, is you need to think about people migrating for standard of living rather than just wage. So you need to subtract out the cost of housing, and that's where we understand what's gone on, is that now people are still moving to where their higher living standards are higher, but now for most people, their living standards will be lower if they move to a higher wage area. All right, so that's the problem. All right, now why not? So tomorrow I am going to be on this panel with Bill Fischel, and we can argue a lot about this. So he has a whole book, Zoning Rules, with an exclamation point. So he is at least fairly enthusiastic about housing regulation, enthusiastic enough to put an exclamation point on the cover. It's fairly rare in economics to have exclamation points on covers. All right, so I'll start off with something I'm pretty sure I agree with Bill, which is that housing regulation has broad support because people think that life will be much worse without it. This is my general view about government. Why do people support almost anything government does? Because they think that life would be worse if government didn't do the thing that government does. And there's a standard list of complaints about why it is great for government to go and regulate housing. Starting with traffic. If we allow them to build more stuff, there's going to be terrible traffic. We don't want traffic, so therefore, don't let them build. Parking. If we let people build stuff, they're going to park around here, and when they park here, it's going to be a pain in the neck for people who are already here to park, so don't let them build anything so parking stays easy. There's the environment, saying, look, we don't want to have any more development that's bad for the environment, let's stop it. There's just preserving the character of the neighborhood. We like things just the way they are, we don't want to change anything, let's keep things the way they are, and we can't do that unless we make it really hard to build things. Right, or they're just preventing conflicting uses. So if you let people build whatever they want, they're going to go and put an urban pig farm right in downtown San Francisco. All right, now here I've got a bunch of rebuttals that I go over in the book. All right, so first big one. This is a slogan that I've been pushing for a while, but I'll push it here. Gratis is not great. Gratis is not great. human beings do love the idea of free stuff, and I think this is so much of the appeal of government, is just government gives you free things. You don't have to pay for it, it's yours. It's like, well, first of all, someone's paying for it, often the prairie person that's receiving it. But secondly, there is, even that aside, there is a really good reason to charge people money for scarce resources, which is it means that the product is available if you want it. Right? If there's ever been a time, well, like during COVID, like I want to get toilet paper, it's not there. What happened? This is a rare case where supermarkets dropped the ball and did not raise the price fast enough to keep the product on the shelf. We notice it because for all the other products, they're doing it all the time without even being asked. Now, this is especially a problem for things like driving. So it took me 90 minutes to get over here from Boston. When I checked my phone in the middle of the night, it said 45 minutes. What was the problem? The problem is that it is free to drive regardless of traffic conditions, which means that when there is a lot of traffic, it is a reason to say, well, maybe I'll go later, but nevertheless, you are not considering the fact that you're inconveniencing other people by adding the congestion. If you were to actually charge people for using the roads and vary the price based upon time of day using this novel technology, probably none of you have it, but a lot of you are going to get this technology. It's a phone. All right, anyway, this is a technology that is now able to make it really easy to charge people prices for driving during peak times, to vary the price based exactly upon traffic conditions. It is also a great way to go and replace other taxes. Singapore is the only country I know of that very heavily uses this kind of thing, and 25% of their government budget comes from just charges on congestion and pollution. Right, so I know New Hampshire already has low taxes, but thinking about ways of getting rid of the other ones. Yeah, if you could, how about charging people for driving on roads during peak times? All right, and same thing goes for parking. Parking, it's more common to have some charge, but normally the price is way below market clearing in desirable areas. And on top of that, they also will say you can only do 2 hours. It's like 25 cents an hour, maximum 2 hours. It's like, why can't it be $1 per hour and I give as many hours as I want? No, we can't do it that way. All right, so yes, these are problems where there is a standard market solution. Because normally in other areas, we don't say, well, grocery stores are going to be too crowded if we allow housing development, so let's not allow new housing. It's only for these things the government runs where they go and they either give them away for free or they just underprice them, that people even have this mentality. If we did charge for them, this would be a much cheaper and more humane solution. And again, when people always say, well, poor people can't afford tolls, can they afford million-dollar apartments? Wouldn't it be better to make housing cheap and driving more expensive and then let people decide which one they want to do? All right, so gratis is not great, and I say this does handle a great many of the complaints that people have about new construction. Say it is not a problem with construction, it is a problem with underpricing of scarce resources that generally are congested. Sorry, a little too fast. Could you go back, Olga? Yes. All right, now, another interesting thing. On the environment, there's actually also some neat work saying something pretty simple. Letting people live in temperate cities is actually very green. Right now, after writing this book, I did become a fan of Alex Epstein's Fossil Future. Great book and a great guy to have out here. But anyway, there's been quite a bit of work on environmental effects of new construction and main things that were discovered. First of all, urban living actually has a lower footprint than suburban living. So when you go and make it really expensive to go and build anything in urban areas, it doesn't mean people don't exist. It doesn't mean they don't live anywhere. It means they go out to another area where they actually have a larger impact. Furthermore, actually it turns out that new houses, though larger, are much better insulated than older houses, and therefore they have a lower footprint as well. So historic homes that you can't change, those are the ones that are a big problem. If you have a general view of environmental impact. So if you were to go and allow people to build new things, and especially you allow them to go and knock down old things and say if it's historic preservation, it's up to the owner if they think it's worth preserving and the market as to whether they're willing to pay to preserve it rather than a matter of government saying all of these old homes in San Francisco are great and can never be torn down. That would be by normal standards of environmental impact and improvement. All right. Now, finally, on market forces and separation of uses. All right, you can probably get an idea why it'd be unlikely to put a pig farm in downtown San Francisco. It's like, well, where do you want to put pig farms? Well, like pigs are not willing to pay very much. Like you could put the pig farm anywhere, right? So as long as the climate and so on is okay for the pigs, there's no reason to go and put things like that in high-value areas, right? Which means that market forces generally do not. Now, there's an economist named Bernard Segan who's famous for his work on Houston, but his more general point is this: there's actually are very standard market forces that tend to naturally lead to a division of uses. For example, for heavy industry, normally you want to put it near docks and train stations. So if it were legal to go and put heavy industry in Beverly Hills, it still probably wouldn't happen because that's not an economically good place to go and put heavy industry. Similarly, if you're doing commercial development, you normally want to put that near major roads so you can get drive-by traffic. If you're building residences, you don't generally want to go and put very low-quality homes in a rich area because you can make more money by doing high-quality homes in a high-quality area. Now, does this mean that there will never be any conflict? No, but that's a lot of the value of the free market is that it is flexible. And it's willing to consider, look, maybe in this particular case, it would actually be a good idea to have a gas station in Beverly Hills, right? Whereas regulation normally is highly inflexible and just says, no, 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 can't do it. It violates the character of the neighborhood. All right. Oh, sorry, Olga? Yes. All right, so really, why not? Bill Fischel. Oh, Bill's over there. Okay, there you are. Okay. All right, so he has a whole book called the home voter hypothesis, saying that actually regulation is at least well designed from the point of view of the median voter in local areas who is a homeowner. Right? So you might say maybe it's bad for society, maybe they're not considering out other people, but still the idea is that it's good for the people who own homes. I think this is actually not such a good story. Right? And so Bill, we'll get a great chance to argue with Bill later on. But anyway, I'll say it's grossly overrated. And by the way, it is the main one that most people that I talk to, whether they're economists or just regular people, say is, well, sure, all this may be true, but homeowners will never go for it. Homeowners are greatly benefited by the status quo and will try to oppose it tooth and branch. So I'll say there's a few things. First of all, if it were really true that the reason why people oppose housing deregulation is just material self-interest, then you could just go into that meeting where people are complaining and write a check and say, hey, all right, let's put a price tag on your complaints. Here's the money, and we'll end it today. Everyone agrees, right? I will just go and pay you off. It could be as simple as, tell you what, we'll have higher property taxes on the new developments. People are already here, their property taxes. Maybe we'll just get rid of them entirely. Just give us a green light, and we can be done with this argument. Right. So people would happily allow development if this theory were true. So if existing property owners would get a big enough tax discount, right? And then or new owners just paid a property tax premium, or it could just be fee for service. Like, you want to build a skyscraper, give me $100 million, and you can do it, and you can start digging today. Right? That is not the way the system works at all. Normally, the way the system works is, Bill is actually pointing out, he is actually on the zoning board, if I heard correctly, which is that people studiously avoid talking about money. Now, one story there is it's all really about money and they just nobody wants to say what the truth is. But I think that's not really the real story. I think there is actually an underlying ideology here. Right? So, yeah, let's make a deal is not the kind of thing that sounds good in politics. It's the kind of thing economists are always thinking, like, why can't we just go and get the anti-abortion people and the anti-death penalty people together and get them to all agree to something? It's like, all right, we'll support your view on abortion, you support our view on the death penalty, and we'll never argue again, right? But you might have noticed that's not how politics works, right? It's not actually horse trading. There are many issues where people just say no deal for any reason at all, ever. Right? That's a bit harder to understand if you just have a very materialistic view of what's going on. Now, in terms of just objective self-interest, I'd also say, what about owners who want to upgrade? What if you want to upgrade? Does the existing system actually benefit you? It's like, well, maybe I'd like to go and build a bigger home here. Maybe I'd like to knock it down and build something totally different. Maybe I would like to sell out to someone that wants to replace my historic San Francisco home with a skyscraper. All of this stuff is not only illegal, but actually generally very unpopular. Now, furthermore, there's actually been some really neat papers showing that renters support regulation too. If it were just people voting based to protect their property values, we would see that local elections would be a mortal combat between homeowners trying to go and keep regulations strict and tenants saying, let her rip, let's build everything. That's not the way it really works. Normally, so-called tenant groups are actually also opposed to it, and when you go and survey tenants, like tenants generally are also hostile to development too. Right, so what's really going on? Well, my first book was called The Myth of the Rational Voter, and I have just a general story that democracy is dysfunctional. It is not based upon objective interest, it's based upon philosophy. Right now, these philosophies are often very poorly worked out, often like almost unbelievably poorly worked out. But still, this is the main reason why people support the policies they do, is they've got a political philosophy and they're voting for the party that they think is closer to their philosophy. Right, so what are the real problems according to me? The first one is just status quo bias. Right, there's a general psychological fact that people usually just think that the grass will be browner on the other side, that change is going to be bad. Right, and you're like, is it though? Just imagine describing all of the possibilities to people in 1900. Do you think that they would actually be excited about it? Probably you go back in 1900, like, oh my God, like think about all the harm it's going to do to farming with this electricity, and just the complaints that people would have, very high. I remember actually in my neighborhood when I was a kid, there was a children's baseball field. They had an enormous amount of land, and they sold out to a developer. My dad was furious. I was saying, this is going to be terrible. Like, just imagine all the horrible things that will happen. Now my dad doesn't even remember he was ever against it, but I remember. Dad, remember how you wanted to prevent those 200 families from having homes on that land? Like, I don't remember that. Well, I do. You did. You said it was going to be the end of the world. All right, so status quo bias, just thinking that things are great now. And I think a lot of this explains the desire to maintain historic homes. It's like, well, what makes you think they won't build something that's even more historic? How do you think the historic stuff got there? Well, they knocked over something else that used to be there, and then they put the thing you like. How do you know if they knocked over the thing you like, they wouldn't build something even better? You don't. Right? There are plenty of reasons to think that progress in general will happen and that people just get used to what they've got. Right, now, a second big one, economic illiteracy. Right now, as I said, I assume everyone here has heard about supply and demand. Things like when the supply of a product goes up, what happens to the price of the product? Yes, it goes down. All right, guess what? They've actually done surveys of random samples of Americans, and most Americans just say, no, it doesn't. And specifically for housing. You just say, what will happen if you allow people to go and build more stuff? You got about a third saying prices will go up, about a third saying no effect, and about a third saying they'll go down. Right? They do not say this for things like used cars. So for used cars, they actually have the reasonable view that, like, when there are production problems in new cars, this will drive up the price of used cars. Everyone remembers this happening a couple years ago. So it's not that people are totally economically illiterate. They have the selective illiteracy for the markets where they have some ideological aversion to actually allowing it. And housing really is this one where it's like, you can't just let people build stuff. You can't just allow fat cats to go and do whatever you want. All right, now, particularly striking on this economic literacy point, there is a UCLA political scientist who has a piece where he actually went and asked people, like, would you favor allowing this development or not? And it was an experiment where he just varied one fact in his survey. And the one fact is he either did or did not mention that a developer would make a lot of money. And merely mentioning without any other facts that the developer would make a lot of money caused support to plummet by, I think, about 30 percentage points. The normal people do not think like economists. They don't think of profit as an incentive that gets people to do good things. Instead, they basically just think of it as a way that somebody goes and rips you off. Right? And in a world where people have this view, then yeah, it's not so surprising that deregulation doesn't sound very good to them. Right now, another factor that I think is very large is just sheer innumeracy. Here's just a real bit of quick math. 1 trillion minus 1 billion approximately equals, and like, you know the approximately equal sign? 1 trillion minus 1 billion approximately equals? No, well, that's exactly. What does it approximately equal? 1 trillion. All right, just common sense. And yet what you'll see is that if you listen to the actual complaints that people make in land use meetings is there'll be just this long list of complaints where you'll say, look, even if you were right about all 20 complaints, these are all small problems compared to the gain, so who cares? But that is not a winning way to actually get people over. And what's the issue? It's like, if you were to say, look, it's $1 billion product and you're trying to stop it because of a bird nest. Like, put a dollar price on a bird nest. And it's like, no, I refuse. This is a terrible way of thinking about things. Like, no, your way is a terrible way of thinking about things. If the entire economy worked the way that you want housing to work, we would be starving to death. Because you'd say, yes, well, look, we can't go and consider the fact that we get all this grain, but it also causes some habitat disruption for some mice. No, we have to consider every single issue. So in the book, I do have a debate on, there's actually a scene where there's a bear debating a mouse on housing regulation, and the bear just says, trillions of gains, and then the mouse has a bunch of tiny complaints. And then you realize this mouse is going to win the debate. He's just saying, like the mouse says, there could be urban pig farms. There could, just go through the list of complaints. Like, these are very unlikely, very small complaints, and yet in a debate, just sheer number of complaints can easily actually win people over, even if you have one argument that, in fact, is a much more significant factor. And last one that I'm also big on is a sheer paranoia. Here again, I think about my dad just saying the sky will fall if they allow this baseball field to be turned into houses. So when I have talked to people about new developments, just the lurid scenarios that they paint, it's like, well, someone could go and build skyscrapers all around you and then cut you off and you won't even be able to leave your own house. Like, you know the movie Up, where the guy gets surrounded. All right, these things, look, it's funny to do it in a cartoon, but is this actually a reasonable forecast? How often does it really happen that allowing people to build things leads to disaster? Is it not more common that actually a lot of good things come out of it? And in the book, I spend quite a bit of time saying, look, there's a lot of talk about what economists call negative externalities of housing. Some of them are genuine, although overstated, because there's just a cheaper way of handling it. Like, how about we deal with traffic with tolls instead of with saying you can't build stuff, right? But on top of all this, there are just a lot of really good things that come when you allow building, which get almost no discussion at all. Things like, well, if we have more people in this area, there'll be more shopping opportunities. If we allow more people in this area, there will be more job opportunities. Or this is one that's been relevant to me. There was a large development near me, and I will confess, it has been a pain in the neck for me. But I keep saying, look, if my kids get one good friend within walking distance of this community, it will more than offset all the problems. Hasn't happened yet, but I'm still optimistic that it will happen. Right? And this is the kind of thing when someone is complaining about all of the horrors of the extra traffic or parking or the noise of the construction. Well, maybe your kid will find a friend there. Have you thought about that? Right. Now, a very good way of just ballparking this to end is this. When someone complains about all the problems with housing, there actually is a pretty straightforward way to avoid all of the problems of people building housing, which is just to live in the middle of nowhere. Right? And almost no one chooses to do this. Instead, there are large numbers of people who voluntarily live in areas that have all of the negatives of high population. Then why do they do it? So it's like high population, they got all the negatives, it's expensive. Like, the only story that really makes sense is because there are a bunch of offsetting positives. The fact that hardly anyone talks about the positives is not a sign that they don't exist, but rather that people are allowing their philosophy to govern their view rather than their observation. Thank you very much. All right. And yes, so this book is releasing on May 1st, and there's a party at the Cato Institute on April 30th, so anyone who's willing to come down there, it's open to the world. So hope we get everyone here coming. Let's see, do we have time for questions, Jason? All right. All right. Sure, right there, please. Let's see, is there a mic? Is there a wandering mic, or just talk loud? Yeah, is that right? Well, so first of all, you should never think of taxes as the primary benefit of a business. The main benefit of business is actually going and offering useful goods and services to the surrounding population. So always worth keeping that in mind. Yes. You think that the point of a city would be to go and create a high standard of living for the people for the people there, rather than specifically the taxes. But also, I would say that the usual view here is that Commercial property is actually the very best kind of property from the point of view of local governments because businesses don't have healthcare problems, businesses don't send kids to schools, businesses hardly ever commit crimes. So actually, the real story is more of why is it that businesses actually pay the same property taxes as residences when residents will wind up using a lot more in services. So at least in most places, there would be the same rate. So I don't know about every, yes. All right, yes, please. Right, and there's always two ways to look about that. So I think the normal view is, isn't it terrible? Shouldn't the city have to abide by the same regulations as everybody else? The other was, maybe the regulations aren't such a good idea in the first place. And maybe when it's the city's own buildings, they realize, well, this costs a lot of money. Whereas when it's somebody else, it's like, well, you've got the money, you can totally afford it. Let's see, yes, please. Yep. So that definitely is one of the better points. It's also one where it's like, like you start off by saying we're going to make education free for all kids because we are so altruistic and wonderful. And then step two is also we don't want any kids in this town. Right? It is a weird thing where it's like, well, we want to have the philosophical feeling of how wonderful we are by virtue of not charging people for education. And then we're going to combine this with saying that you're not allowed to go and take part in it. And I would say file this under that same point I made about gratis is not great, and that going and saying that government is going to go and provide free service to everyone is actually not nearly as good of an idea as people like to imagine. I mean, it's also one to play into what I'm talking about tomorrow, where it's like, would it be possible to go and provide high quality education for a lower price? Could the free market do it, or could vouchers do it? And I think there's very strong evidence, yes. So, it's one where if you just sort of lock in the assumptions of we have to go and pay $25,000 for every kid, we can't go and charge different property tax rates to different people, then obviously we'd be monsters if we went and charged people, but we'd also be fools if we allowed people to take advantage of it. So it's the kind of thing where people are used to it, so it makes sense to them, but when you step back, it's like it's a very odd view of the world. Well, so like I said, that could be, but it's not nearly as true as people imagine because we've got a few things going on. So one is, what if you want to go and improve your house and you can't get permission? What if you want to subdivide your lot? What if you want to sell out to a developer? Or here's one that I didn't mention but is really worth talking about. A lot of parents right now are faced with a tough choice. Either their kid is going to live hundreds of miles away from them because they can't afford to live in the same area where their parents are because housing is too expensive, or you go and you give your kid the down payment for the house. This is one where it's like, well, maybe we better if housing were cheaper and even my house was cheaper. I lost some money, but then it was cheap enough so that my kids could go and afford to live next to me without getting a big subsidy. So again, the point of this is not that housing regulation never hurts homeowners or housing deregulation would never hurt homeowners. Definitely would in some cases. But the idea that it definitely does always is not true. It's actually quite a bit more complicated than that. And if you really step back, I think it's clear, it's not that clear that homeowners actually benefit from the status quo. Maybe they do. Depends upon the circumstances. Depends upon whether you have an opportunity to subdivide your home, whether there's a developer that would like to go and buy up the block and put a skyscraper there. Right? And really, if you think through the economics very seriously, in an area like San Francisco, the best thing of all would be if your block were deregulated and the rest of the city were not. Then everyone in your neighborhood sells out to build skyscrapers. There's barely any change in the overall price because it's just one block. You walk away with your giant paycheck from the developer, and then you can go and live somewhere else in the city for barely a higher price. Right? And the fact that is obviously true and yet would have no political traction, I think it does just show how much, even local politics is not really governed by any kind of careful cost-benefit calculation, right? Which way you say, well, is that good news or bad news? It's complicated. On the one hand, it's like, gee, if people were voting just their narrow self-interest, I could just go and make them a deal and get them on board. On the other hand, it means that you could go and persuade people by changing their minds about the right political philosophy without changing their interests because that wasn't really what got them into their position in the first place, usually. Yes, in the back there. For questions like that, I always start off, well, first of all, maybe you're right. So maybe it is a concern. And then next step is, so do we know? Do we know, is it actually true that people that are coming in are going to have not only different views, but if you're talking to individuals, like, do they have worse views? Do we know this? So for example, I've spent a lot of time in Texas during COVID to avoid the COVID regime of Virginia. And there is a very standard view in Texas thinking that people moving into Texas are going to go and change Texas, right, for the worse specifically. But when my former student, Ben Powell, actually went to the data, he said, look, it turns out that actually on average people that move to Texas are more Republican than Texans themselves. It's like, now that's just one case, but it is one where people assume they knew the answer, right? And why do they think they know the answer? Well, probably they were in Austin and they noticed that there were a bunch of Democrats from California moving to Austin. So yeah, but Austin was already 90% Democratic. So it's not like they're changing things. Maybe the Californians are only 80% Democratic and they're making Austin less Democratic. Have you thought about that? So for any question like this, it's like step one is, do we really know that the facts are facts? And at least for like that case in Texas, it's very standardly believed in Texas that people moving into Texas are making Texas less Texan. And it seems that that is wrong. The opposite is true. All right, now next thing I would say is even if it does seem like people are going and making politics worse, how much worse? Is it like 0.0001% worse? Or is it like 50% worse? There is something special about the Free State Project, which is that you consciously came here in order to change the state. People like you are either great or dangerous, depending on your point of view. On the other hand, the vast majority of people who move to another state have no plans to change the state. Often they'll move to a state without even knowing what the state is like politically. It's like they come there for a job, or they come there because they like the taxes or the housing, but other than that, they don't know much about it. Right now, there's a lot of Californians who move to Texas who are like, oh, I didn't know it was going to be like this. Also, I'm staying. Right? Because it turns out I could, if I ever needed to get an abortion, I could just go to another state. So what I would say is that, like, in other work that I've done in immigration, I am very open to the idea that this could be an issue. I do think that people are very quick to assume the worst. So there's that the paranoid leap of just saying this is going to be terrible rather than saying it's a possibility. Now, again, if you're going door to door, then maybe this isn't going to work either, honestly. So when you're saying that a YIMBY is getting voted out of office, that doesn't surprise me, because the issue is that I'm always promoting ideas that I think are correct and unpopular. Right? If they were correct and popular, then I'd say, well, they'll probably take care of themselves. They don't need me to write a book. So that's a lot of what I'm doing. Yeah, please. Right. So usual view for the U.S. is that it was basically quite mild until 1970. So basically until around 1970, it seemed like, at least nationally, when housing prices got above the cost of production, they would go back down again. And then around 1970, it seems like there is some kind of a rough break. So as to what's going on, some of it probably is that the laws actually got stricter. Another part, though, is just enforcement and people realizing ways they can use existing laws that are already in the books to actually stop things. So I think that it's some combination of all of those that winds up explaining what occurred. And again, a lot of what's going on with zoning, when you really read the empirical work, is that often there's a project that is in fact legal. However, there are so many hoops to jump through in order to prove that it's legal that it takes 10 years to get it approved, and if it takes 10 years to get it approved, you're not going to bother doing it. So that's something also that has occurred. Something that people have talked about a bit is in the 60s, there's a big rise of community activists. And normally, it turns out community activists want to go and stop things from being built. Right? And I think actually built into some federal regulation is you need to go and involve your community activists in local planning. Right? So that's probably another thing going on, is that it did lead to the existence of a movement that punches way above weight. Here, one example from my area is that they actually have gone and installed express toll lanes very close to my house, which I think is great. However, there are a lot of people that normally would have been really against this. Actually, what I should say is almost all humans are against charging people to drive. No matter how badly they are stuck in traffic every single day, and even if you say, look, you are being paid less than minimum wage to sit in traffic. Wouldn't it be good if you could just go and pay some money and then the roads would work? No, it's terrible. All right, but anyway, what's striking is that they were not really worried about general public uproar. It seems that when they went and installed toll roads in Northern Virginia, they're mostly worried about activist groups. And they figured out a way to get them on board with toll roads. And that was by giving them an incredibly expensive bike lane used by virtually no people. Right, so if you go in the bridge near my house, it is a 10-lane highway with a bike lane, which would have been the 11th lane. And for this bike lane, they have they have barriers to make sure the ultra rare cyclists don't get killed. It is one of the worst bike lanes you can imagine because you have horrible traffic noise there. You would have to be hard of hearing to enjoy this bike ride, but they gave them this ultra inefficient bribe of we'll give you a bike lane, and then they said, okay, then we won't go and protest and say this is just motivated by greed. So that's pretty typical, unfortunately. Yes, Jason. I guess I would start by saying that someone who actually has influence to get things built. So anyone here a housing mogul or anything like that? Or know someone who is. I mean, I would actually start with that of just saying, look, there's those people are already connected, they already have friends, and then there's the question of if you can turn this from this is something good for me personally into something that is actually good for society generally. I think that is one of the better things to push for. So there's that. There is this YIMBY movement which has taken off in the U.S. It's striking that most people who are actual self-conscious YIMBYs are generally on the left, even though we also have a lot of good evidence that left-wing cities have stricter housing regulation. Right? So basically, they don't really speak for the left in general. They are a very narrow corner of the left, but nevertheless, they are very active, and they do punch above weight. So that is something to give them credit for. So say people that have connections with them or feel like they can go and work well with them, that would be one of the better opportunities as well. I mean, honestly, I come to the Free State Project hat in hand saying, can you tell me how to go and sell these ideas? Because you guys are doing stuff, and that's pretty amazing when you think about it. Yeah, so it's a very good point. I didn't see many researchers working on this. It's very believable. It's also one where I'd say the question is, how much of this rise in quality would have happened anyway, and how much is caused by the regulation? But it seems like you know more. So you think that actually a lot of the requirements are ones that people wouldn't actually pay their own money for. Yeah, that does make sense. And yeah, so I know that this was actually another weird thing that happened to me. We were putting an addition on our home, and then the rule was they were trying to prevent us from installing they wanted to limit the size of our air conditioning unit, but by making it bigger, then they were able to say, well, if the addition's bigger, then you need a bigger air conditioning unit, so then we'll give you permission. It's like, So again, this seems like it really is highly arbitrary, but yes. Let's see, someone who hasn't asked a question yet? Yes, please. Yeah, so in the book I go over rent control and how it is a classic wrong-headed move where the problem is low supply, and then you just say that we're going to go and put a price control, which does not do anything to make housing more abundant. In terms of what can be done, starting back, it is kind of amazing that we don't have a lot more rent control, because when you ask people, normal people think that it's a great. Say, oh yeah, that sounds really great. As to why it hasn't occurred, so again, Bill Fischel may have the story here where there's just too many homeowners who don't like the idea, but. So it does seem like it primarily does catch on in ideologically highly left-wing places, but also ones where you've got this core of activists that are willing to go and push it very hard. So I'd say that the main thing protecting us is probably just lack of activists. So and it's like, well, thank goodness that there aren't that many of them, because otherwise they probably would be able to go and mess up the whole national housing market. If you're in an area that has it, the only thing that I know of that works is going to the courts. So I actually was in Berkeley during the late 80s, early 90s when they had some of the strictest rent control of the country. Where basically, some of the older people here will remember that there was very high inflation during the 80s, and Berkeley went and basically wouldn't allow you to raise rent at all during this period of very high inflation. I think it was they let you raise it at 40% of inflation. So basically, every year prices were getting more and more below market. And then the wife of the philosopher John Searle, who was my teacher, went and sued the city. And she was able to go and not only say that you have to at least allow them to raise the price for inflation, but also to retroactively reverse 10 years of rent control. So overnight, rents rose 30% through the courts. So honestly, based upon what I know, I think the courts are your last reasonable bet. All right, other questions? Anything at all? All right, well, so... All right. Well, anyway, thank you very much for this incredibly warm New Hampshire welcome. I really appreciate it.